Life, as I've come to know it, is a tapestry of routines, each thread meticulously woven to maintain a semblance of normalcy. My name is Sophie, a 38-year-old literature teacher, married to Julian, an architect whose passion for his work often eclipses everything else. Together, we have two children, a 13-year-old daughter and a 10-year-old son, both engulfed in their own worlds of adolescence and primary school adventures. Our mornings are a predictable flurry of activity. The alarm clock blares at 6:30 a.m., a siren tearing through the silence of dawn. I shuffle out of bed, often finding Julian's side already vacant, a cold reminder of his early starts. The preparation for the day begins in a systematic fashion, brewing coffee, flipping pancakes, reminding the kids to brush their teeth, and double-checking backpacks. At work, the school corridors echo with the familiar cacophony of youthful chatter and locker slams. My days are spent in the embrace of literature, dissecting the intricacies of prose and poetry with students whose interest in the subject varies from passionate to non-existent. I often find solace in the words of the authors I teach, their narratives a subtle escape from the mundanity of my existence. Evenings at home are a mirror of the morning, structured, timed, and predictable. Julian usually arrives late, his face etched with the day's fatigue, often bringing work home. Dinner conversations revolve around mundane topics, school projects, neighborhood gossip, and the occasional planning of family outings that rarely materialize due to Julian's hectic schedule. In the quiet hours after the children have succumbed to sleep and house hums with the silence of the night, I often find myself sitting at the kitchen table, a cup of tea in hand, staring into the void. These moments are my silent companions, a time to reflect on the day gone by and the one to come, a repetitive cycle that defines my existence. It was during one of these evenings that the past decided to re-enter my life, an unexpected message on social media, a simple hello from Thomas, a former student, now a writer. Little did I know, this innocuous greeting was the first ripple in the calm waters of my life, a precursor to the storm that was about to unfold. The message from Thomas arrived on a Thursday evening, a blip on the screen that momentarily drew me away from my routine. Thomas had been one of my more memorable students, known for his eloquent essays and a keen interest in classic literature. His message, brief yet courteous, inquired about my well-being and mentioned his recent accomplishment, the publication of his first novel. Curiosity piqued, I responded, congratulating him on his success and expressing a genuine interest in his work. Our conversation, initially revolving around his book and literary pursuits, gradually evolved into a regular exchange. We discussed various authors and their styles, the evolution of literary genres, and the challenges of writing. Thomas's perspective was refreshing, his insights sharp, igniting a spark in our discussions that I hadn't realized I was missing. As weeks turned into months, our communication became a regular part of my evenings. Julian, often preoccupied with his architectural designs, hardly noticed my growing engagement in these online conversations. For me, these interactions with Thomas became a window to a world I had long forgotten, a world where passion for literature wasn't just a professional requirement, but a shared enthusiasm. One late autumn evening, Thomas suggested meeting up to discuss a book we had both been reading. The idea, innocent in its inception, seemed like a natural progression of our literary camaraderie. We agreed to meet at a local cafe, a neutral space where the aroma of coffee and the rustle of pages would complement our discussion. The day of the meeting arrived with a mix of anticipation and a sense of normalcy. I chose a simple outfit, nothing too formal, nothing too casual, and left the house under the pretext of an evening with colleagues. The cafe was a quaint little place, nestled between a bookstore and an art gallery, its windows fogged up from the warmth inside. Thomas was already there, seated at a corner table with two coffees, his face lighting up as I entered. We greeted each other with a polite awkwardness, a physical manifestation of our previously digital-only interactions. The conversation started with the book but soon meandered through various topics, his writing process, my teaching experiences, and subtle glimpses into our personal lives. As the evening wore on, I found myself engrossed in our conversation, the hours slipping away unnoticed. It was only when the cafe staff began closing up that we realized how long we had been there. Parting ways, we agreed to meet again, both under the guise of our shared literary interests. Little did I realize then, that this meeting was the beginning of a journey that would lead me down a path far removed from the predictable life I had been living. The meetings with Thomas became a more frequent occurrence, evolving from discussions about literature to sharing personal anecdotes and laughter. It was a refreshing change from my daily life, a secret escape that I looked forward to with increasing anticipation. Our conversations were no longer confined to the walls of the cafe. They spilled over into walks in the park, visits to local bookstores, and quiet dinners in discreet corners of the city. Julian, immersed in his work, remained oblivious to these developments. At home, I maintained the facade of normalcy, performing my roles as a wife and mother with practiced ease. However, inside, I felt a growing disconnect from the life I was leading and the one I was secretly yearning for. As spring turned to summer, the nature of my relationship with Thomas began to shift. What started as intellectual attraction slowly morphed into something more. The realization hit me one evening when Thomas casually took my hand as we walked. The contact was brief, but it sent a jolt through me, awakening feelings I hadn't experienced in years. One night, after a particularly engaging dinner, Thomas walked me to my car. The air was warm, and the streets were bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. It was then, in that moment of solitude, that our relationship crossed the line. A kiss, hesitant at first, then deepening with a passion that surprised us both, sealed our descent into an affair. The following weeks were a whirlwind. We met more frequently, each encounter intensifying our connection. Messages and calls filled the gaps between our meetings, creating a constant presence in each other's lives. I was aware of the risks, the potential devastation it could bring to my family, but I was too entangled in the web of the affair to pull away. Despite the guilt that gnawed at me, I continued to meet Thomas. Our liaisons were carefully planned to avoid suspicion, often under the guise of work-related meetings or outings with friends. The thrill of the secret, combined with the intensity of our connection, created a bubble around us, isolating us from the reality of our actions. As autumn approached, the inevitability of our situation began to weigh on me. I knew that what we were doing was wrong, that it was only a matter of time before our secret world would collide with reality. The thought of hurting Julian and my children filled me with dread. Yet I felt powerless to end the affair. It was a precarious balance, a dance on the edge of a precipice, and I was all too aware that one misstep could send everything crashing down. But in the midst of it all, I was unable to resist the pull of the affair, caught in the grip of something that felt larger than life, yet fraught with the potential for destruction. The precarious balance of my double life began to unravel one evening in late autumn. Julian, who seldom pried into my affairs, accidentally stumbled upon a string of messages from Thomas on my phone. The messages, laden with endearments and plans for future meetings, laid bare the truth I had been hiding. Confrontation was inevitable. That night, as I returned home, I was met with the somber silence that blanketed the house. Julian sat at the kitchen table, my phone beside him, his expression a mix of hurt and disbelief. The air was thick with tension as I braced myself for the inevitable. "Is there something you want to tell me?" Julian's voice was calm, but it bore the weight of 1,000 unspoken accusations. The words caught in my throat, guilt and fear intertwining, rendering me momentarily speechless. The conversation that ensued was a painful unraveling of the lies I had woven. Julian's questions, direct and piercing, demanded honesty, and with each answer, the facade of our marriage crumbled. I admitted to the affair with Thomas, trying to explain the how and why, but the words sounded hollow even to my own ears. Julian's reaction was a mixture of anger, hurt, and confusion. He struggled to comprehend how I, the woman he had loved and trusted for over 15 years, could betray him in such a manner. The questions he asked were ones I had asked myself countless times. Why did I do it? What was I looking for? Did I ever think of the consequences? That night, the house felt colder than usual, the walls echoing with the remnants of our shattered trust. Julian slept in the guest room, a physical manifestation of the emotional chasm that had opened between us. The reality of what I had done, the magnitude of my betrayal, began to sink in. In the days that followed, our home became a battleground of emotions. Julian oscillated between anger and sorrow, while I grappled with guilt and regret. Discussions about the future of our marriage were fraught with uncertainty. Julian was clear about one thing: the children should not be made to suffer because of our issues. I suggested counseling, a desperate attempt to salvage what was left of our marriage. Julian, though hesitant, agreed. It was a small glimmer of hope in an otherwise dark situation. However, the path to healing was fraught with obstacles, the foremost being whether we could ever rebuild the trust that had been so thoroughly broken. As we embarked on this uncertain journey, I couldn't help but reflect on the irony of my situation. In seeking something that I thought was missing in my life, I had risked everything that truly mattered. The affair, which had once seemed like an escape, now felt like a chain that bound me to a future filled with uncertainty and remorse. In the wake of the confrontation, the atmosphere in our home became one of palpable tension. Julian and I moved through our days like strangers, our interactions limited and strained. The children, sensing the shift, reacted in their own ways. Our daughter became quiet and withdrawn, while our son displayed bouts of anger and confusion. Amidst this turmoil, I continued to grapple with my own turmoil. The affair with Thomas, now ended abruptly, left a void, but it was overshadowed by the guilt and the pain I saw in Julian's eyes every day. I knew I had to make things right, not just for my sake but for our family. Julian, for his part, was torn. The man I knew, who once spoke of forgiveness and understanding, was now distant, his pain evident. Yet he didn't ask for a divorce. Instead, he suggested we maintain a semblance of normalcy for the children until we figured out what to do next. The counseling sessions began, a weekly ritual where we laid bare our feelings and grievances under the guidance of a therapist. Julian spoke of his sense of betrayal and loss of trust. I listened, each word a reminder of the hurt I had caused. I talked about the loneliness and disconnection I had felt in our marriage, which led me to seek solace elsewhere. The therapist worked with us to understand our emotions and to find a path towards healing or closure. Meanwhile, Thomas tried to reach out to me, but I ignored his attempts. My focus was on repairing the damage I had caused to my family. Yet, the strain of the situation was evident. Our home, once a haven of love and laughter, had turned into a place of silent battles and unspoken grief. As the weeks turned into months, Julian and I made an effort to be civil to each other, especially in front of the children. We attended school events, had family dinners, and maintained the routines that had anchored our family lives. But the undercurrent of tension was always there, an invisible barrier that kept us from truly reconnecting. The turning point came one evening when our daughter, unable to bear the silent conflict, broke down in tears. She begged us to stop pretending and to be honest about what was happening. That night, Julian and I had a long heart-to-heart conversation. It was the first time since the confrontation that we had really communicated. We talked about our marriage, our children, and what we both wanted for the future. The conversation was difficult, but it was necessary. It became clear that while Julian was willing to work on our marriage, the path to rebuilding trust was going to be long and uncertain. The possibility of our family staying intact seemed slim, but we agreed to keep trying for the sake of our children. The chapter closes with Sophie reflecting on the complexity of their situation, recognizing the long road ahead in either healing or parting ways, and the impact their decisions would have on their family. The challenges of rebuilding our family were compounded by an unexpected factor, Thomas. After I had ended our affair, I hoped he would respect my decision and move on. However, it became apparent that Thomas was not ready to let go. His attempts to contact me grew more frequent and insistent, shifting from regretful messages to outright pleas and eventually to thinly veiled threats. Thomas's persistence added an extra layer of stress to an already strained situation. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, fearful of an encounter that could further jeopardize my efforts to mend my marriage. His messages, which I had initially ignored, became impossible to overlook when he started hinting at making our affair public. Julian, already struggling with the betrayal, became even more troubled when he learned about Thomas's behavior. The knowledge that someone else was aggressively trying to insert themselves into our already fragile situation added a new dimension of tension between us. Our therapist advised me to be transparent with Julian about Thomas's actions. Following this advice, I showed Julian the messages. He read them, his expression a mix of anger and concern. We discussed the possibility of taking legal action if Thomas's behavior escalated, but we both hoped it would not come to that. The situation with Thomas reached a critical point one evening when he unexpectedly showed up at a restaurant where Julian and I were trying to have a quiet dinner. His appearance was shocking, not just for the confrontation it promised, but for the potential scene it could cause. Thomas approached our table, his demeanor erratic, demanding to speak with me. Julian stood up, positioning himself between Thomas and me, a clear sign of his intention to protect. The altercation was brief but intense, with Thomas loudly accusing me of betrayal and Julian demanding he leave. The restaurant staff intervened, and Thomas was eventually escorted out, but the damage was done. The incident left us shaken and more aware of the potential danger Thomas posed. In the days that followed, Julian and I took steps to ensure our family's safety. We informed the school of the situation, cautioning them to be vigilant. We also spoke to a lawyer about a restraining order against Thomas. These actions, necessary as they were, felt like an intrusion into the life we were trying to rebuild, a constant reminder of the affair's far-reaching consequences. The ordeal with Thomas was a harsh wake-up call. It highlighted not just the personal toll of my actions, but also the external threats that could arise from choices made in secrecy. As we dealt with the aftermath of the confrontation at the restaurant, I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of responsibility for the chaos that had engulfed our lives. The incident with Thomas at the restaurant was a stark reminder of how deeply our family life had been affected by my actions. The tension at home, already high, escalated further as Julian and I grappled with the additional stress caused by Thomas's intrusion. Our children, sensitive to the changing dynamics, exhibited signs of emotional distress. Our daughter's performance at school began to suffer, and our son became increasingly withdrawn. Julian and I were struggling not just with our personal issues but also with the need to provide a stable environment for our children. The counseling sessions continued, focusing not only on the issues between us, but also on how to best support our children through this tumultuous period. We sought guidance on how to communicate with them about what was happening in a way that was age-appropriate and reassuring. Despite the challenges, Julian and I made concerted efforts to maintain a semblance of normalcy for the sake of our children. We kept up with family routines, attended school events together, and tried to ensure that home life remained as stable as possible. However, the strain was evident. Our interactions, though civil, were often forced, and the distance between us was palpable. During this period, I reflected a lot on my choices and their impact. The affair, which had started as a means of seeking something missing in my life, had spiraled into a situation that threatened the very foundation of my family. The guilt I felt was overwhelming, compounded by the sight of my children's confusion and pain. Julian, despite his own hurt, showed a remarkable strength in dealing with the situation. He was actively involved in the children's lives, providing them with the support and stability they needed. His ability to put aside his feelings for the sake of our children was something I admired, even as it served as a painful reminder of the damage I had caused. As we navigated these challenges, the legal situation with Thomas was resolved. The restraining order was granted, providing us with a sense of security, though the fear of what he might do lingered. This resolution, however small, was a step towards regaining control over our lives. The chapter closes with Sophie acknowledging the complex web of consequences resulting from her affair. The realization that her actions have caused deep and possibly irreparable damage to her family weighs heavily on her, even as she and Julian strive to navigate this challenging period together. As autumn gave way to winter, the fragile equilibrium in our household began to shift. The combined weight of the affair, the issues with Thomas, and the ongoing strain on our family took its toll. Julian and I, despite our best efforts, were drifting further apart. The gap that had formed between us seemed insurmountable, and the counseling sessions, once a place for open communication, became a forum for airing grievances and disappointments. The realization that our marriage might not survive became increasingly apparent. Julian, once willing to consider reconciliation, began to speak of separation as a real possibility. The discussions about our future, which had been tinged with hope, now took on a tone of resignation. During this period, our children continued to struggle. Our daughter, caught in the tumult of teenage years and the chaos at home, became more rebellious. Our son, younger and less able to articulate his feelings, showed signs of anxiety. Julian and I were united in our concern for them, but divided in everything else. The turning point came unexpectedly one evening. Julian and I had a particularly tense exchange, which escalated into a heated argument. The first time our emotions had spilled over so visibly. The children overheard, and their reactions, fear, confusion, tears, were a stark reminder of the impact our issues were having on them. That night, after the children were asleep, Julian and I had a long, difficult conversation. It was clear that while we both cared deeply for our children, our marriage was beyond repair. The love and trust that had once bound us together had been eroded by my betrayal and the subsequent events. We discussed the possibility of separation, a topic that was painful but necessary. The idea of dividing our family, of not seeing our children every day, was heart-wrenching, but we had to consider what was best for them in the long term. We agreed to seek legal advice on how to handle the separation in a way that would minimize the impact on the children. As I lay in bed that night, the reality of the situation washed over me. My affair, which had started as a misguided attempt to find validation and excitement, had led to the unraveling of my family. The enormity of my mistake was clear, and the knowledge that I was responsible for the pain and disruption in our lives was a burden I would carry with me.